Today we'll be reviewing a 300 meter ISO rated Helm Komodo. We're going deep with this Komodo. Deep down into the murky depths of this very long candle holder. We're going where no man has ever gone before. You're looking at a second generation Komodo, which at the time of this video's publication is the latest generation. I paid $315 for it, which includes shipping. I'm not sure how fast this second batch of Komodos sold out, but within 2 hours of its going on sale, it was gone. I've never seen the first generation Komodo, but from what I know, the big change in the Komodo in the second generation is that it uses what Helm calls the FC1 clasp. The FC1 clasp is the same clasp that the Helm Currabury that I reviewed last year uses. The FC1 clasp doesn't have a self-adjustment feature that I believe the first generation Komodo had. Helm sells an FC2 clasp as well as an accessory. The FC2 clasp has a self-adjustment feature and may be the same clasp that they put on their first generation Komodo. The Komodo comes in a relatively small, sturdy cardboard box and a very well-packaged, medium-sized outer box. It comes with some extraneous items, which I'm not going to show you. The important items are an instruction manual, which is the most informative and useful watch manual I've ever read. It put the fear of God into me about wearing watches in the shower. The Komodo also comes with a record of testing, which is probably to meet their ISO 6425 requirement. It also comes with a 1-year warranty card. The Komodo comes out of the box on a NATO. If I were wearing a Komodo on a NATO, I'd put it on one with smoother material, but the supplied NATO is adequate. I think it would have been better had the watch come out of the box with the metal bracelet on, as it's a lot easier to take off a metal bracelet than put on a metal bracelet, though I didn't find the bracelet overly difficult to put on. The Komodo comes with a bunch of extra industrial strength spring bars and a screwdriver for sizing the bracelet screw pins. I think all watches should not only have screw pins, but come with screwdrivers like the Komodo. It really makes life a lot easier. I used the supplied screwdriver to size the bracelet and it worked great. The case of the Komodo is 40 millimeters in diameter. This is a small case size by modern standards. The Komodo looks larger than what it is. To give you some perspective, I'm showing the Komodo side by side with the Seiko 5 Sports, a 43 millimeter diameter watch that is virtually identical in size to the Seiko SKX. The Komodo looks bigger. The large protruding crown of the Komodo makes it look bigger than what it is. Also, the Komodo has a longer case with considerably longer lugs. Viewed from the side, the Komodo case looks a lot thicker than the Seiko 5 Sports, though it's only 13% thicker. The Komodo's bracelet links look a lot thicker than the Seiko 5 Sports too, but are only 11% thicker. The Komodo is a heavy watch. It's 196 grams. Size for my wrist, which is about 7 inches, and 212 grams unsized. The entire Komodo is brushed. I love all brushed watches, and Helm did a nice job with the brushing. I also love orangey dive watches and didn't have any regrets about buying the orange dialed Komodo until I tried to read the date. The contrast between the black letters and the orange background of the date wheel is poor. I don't think the date is centered properly, though it's not too off. I don't have great eyesight. I find reading the Komodo's date to be anywhere from very challenging to impossible, depending on light conditions. If I were to buy the watch again, I'd buy the white dialed variant, as this one probably has the most readable date. If you buy the orange dialed variant and don't want to wear the watch on the bracelet, I recommend buying the orange Helm RS1 rubber strap add-on, as it looks great with the dial and feels very comfortable. When I buy a small watch like the Komodo, I'm expecting a watch that is not going to feel bulky, but that's not what I get with the Komodo. The Komodo's bracelet width is 20 millimeters. That's what I expect in a 40 millimeter dive watch. But not only does the Komodo have absolutely no taper, the clasp goes up to an astonishing 25 millimeters in width at its widest point. The Helm that I reviewed that shares the FC1 clasp with the Komodo is a much bigger watch. The Burgundy had a 22 millimeter bracelet, but it tapered down to 20 millimeters, allowing it to fit the FC1 clasp. I like the FC1 clasp. It's a solid, well-made clasp. The issue here is not the quality and functionality of the clasp. The issue is putting a clasp on the Komodo that was intended to accommodate a much larger watch. I would argue that the FC1 clasp is even a little too big for the Burgundy as well. Notice all the clearance here. There's all that clearance because the clasp is generic and was intended to fit watches with very thick links like the Burgundy. The FC1 clasp is too big for the Komodo in every dimension. Clearly, putting a 25 millimeter wide clasp on a 20 millimeter bracelet is clownish and ridiculous. All the clearance here reveals it's too high. It's also too long. The links of the bracelet are 9 millimeters in length, and the clasp's 6 micro adjustments are spaced at 2 millimeters. This means that the optimal amount of micro adjusts for the Komodo is 4. You don't gain anything by adding more micro adjusts. The clasp is 5 millimeters longer than it should be. When I surrender $315 of my hard-earned money to someone for a watch, I expect its clasp to not be supersized and to have the right amount of micro adjusts. This is a Helm, a respected independent watchmaker. If I wanted a watch that was a grotesque Frankensteinian assemblage of parts, I'd buy a watch that you can buy right away in an online store, rather than having to wait 6 months for Helm to put out a tiny batch of 200 watches that get gobbled up right away in an online watch feeding frenzy. The result of putting a 20 millimeter bracelet that doesn't taper, that has a monster clasp, onto a small 40 millimeter watch is pretty predictable. It makes the watch wear like a larger watch with a bulky 22 millimeter bracelet. The case of the Komodo tended to flop around a lot on my wrist, perhaps because of its short, stubby lugs, or perhaps I just noticed the watch flopping around more because the feeling of the rear of the bracelet sloshing around on my wrist was so uncomfortable, so I ended up sizing the watch a little tighter than I normally would. The Komodo isn't unwearable. It wears like a watch that sits on the wrist well, yet has an overly bulky 22 millimeter bracelet. It wears better than both the Orient Kamasu and the Heimdallr SKX homage, but this isn't saying much, as both of these watches for me were unwearable. As you can see, the sides of the Komodo's links look very square and could stand to be smoothed better, but they are in the realm of what I would consider to be acceptable. It's hard to evaluate the feel of the Komodo's bracelet as the monster clasp throws everything out of whack. Aesthetically, I think the bracelet could have used at least 2 millimeters of taper, especially given how small the case is. The case integrates with the bracelet exceptionally well. You'll rarely see seamless integration like this on a sub-$500 watch. One thing that concerns me is that one of the end links is too loose. The bracelet has nice pivoting end links. This makes the case look more prominent and classier. I think the Komodo has a really divey looking dial. I've already mentioned the issue of the Komodo's date being fairly unreadable. My only other issue with the dial is the partial crosshair. There are lines extending from the 12, 3, 6, and 9 indices. I hate crosshair patterns on watches. I don't know what function they have, but for me, all they do is clutter the dial. The logo and writing on the watch is small, minimal, and discreet. I wish all dive watches were like this. I like the handset and the indices, which have adequate depth. I really like the striking bright white color of the handset and indices. The Komodo uses a double dome sapphire crystal with colorless anti-reflective coating. I didn't have any problems with glare with the Komodo. I really like that the crystal is only slightly domed. It's domed just enough to make it sexy, yet not enough to cause much glare and distortion. A slightly domed crystal gives you the best of both worlds. The bezel insert is completely fine, but I'm going to get very picky here. The bezel insert is stainless steel with black PVD coating. I worry about PVD coating scratching, though I suspect it'll be more scratch resistant than aluminum. Aesthetically, I think the Komodo would have looked a lot better with a nice shiny ceramic bezel, but this is my personal preference. Some people don't like the look of ceramic. It might have been easier for Helm to apply Lume to the bezel using the material that they used. I'll cover Lume later. The bezel is 120 click. As you can see, the bezel doesn't line up correctly. It's off by about a click. The bezel's teeth weren't smoothed properly, and it's abrasive to turn. I had the same issue with the Burgundy, and that's one of the reasons why I eventually sold the watch. The bezel might loosen up over time, and the sharpness of the teeth may become less of an issue. I'm going to ask people to restrain their impulse to tell me in the comments that Helm made the bezel too coarse deliberately because it was meant to be turned using diving gloves. Helm didn't do a half-assed job on the bezel teeth on purpose. The Komodo is a 300-meter rated dive watch. With a few exceptions, I think rating dive watches over 200 meters is gimmicky. At 15.5 millimeters in thickness, the Komodo is a thick watch. Some of the thickness may be a byproduct of the watch being designed to withstand a ridiculous amount of water pressure. I know Helm was going for an overbuilt look with the Komodo, but making the height of the case larger than it needs to be while keeping the case width small doesn't look right to me. I think the Komodo would have looked better and been more practical if it had not exceeded 14 millimeters in thickness. The case has drilled lug holes. The case is very ergonomic and conforms to the wrist very well. It just has a tendency to flop around, as I've already mentioned. The lug-to-lug of 47 millimeters, while not big, is bigger than I thought it would be, considering how small the case is. The crown is very large and prominently placed. It is nicely signed. My only issue with the crown is that it isn't smooth enough. I don't typically wind automatics, but if I did, I might become annoyed with having to grate my fingers a little in order to wind it. I don't start to feel the abrasion from the crown until I give it about 40 winds. The crown is likely to smooth out with time as you sand it down with your fingers. The stem is thin and too wobbly. The action is fine. The vacuum seal is great. The case back is pretty damn cool. There's not much more to say here. I'm comparing the Lume of the Komodo against my control watch, the Seiko 5 Sports on the left. The Komodo uses BGW9 Lume. Helm did a fantastic application of this Lume with well above average distribution. The Komodo has the brightest Lume job I've ever seen. I made the mistake of charging the Lume with a flashlight one night before sleeping with the watch, and there was so much light emanating from the Lume that it annoyed me and caused me to have some difficulty getting to sleep. The Lume has good staying power too. My camera is not nearly as sensitive as your eye. You'll be able to see the Lume all night long. The bezel insert is lumed exceptionally well. You'll often see lumed bezel inserts losing their lume much earlier than the lume on the dial. This didn't happen. The Komodo uses the entry-level Seiko NH35 movement. The movement is running 3 seconds a day fast in the horizontal position and running perfectly in the vertical position. This is well within specification. After about 4 months of fairly heavy use, I sold my Burgundy at auction on eBay and got back my initial investment. I suspect that the Komodo retains a lot of its value as well. I can't endorse the Komodo. You can't put a generic monster clasp on a small watch and expect me to pass it. Even if the Komodo had a good clasp and the watch was comfortable to wear, at best I would have given the Komodo a very marginal pass because the teeth of its bezel are way too sharp. The Komodo looks more expensive than what it is. It has a well-made dial, a really nice crystal, and the case and bracelet actually look as if they were designed for each other. Closer inspection of the Komodo has revealed to me a trend of shoddiness and lack of quality control. Many watches in the sub-$500 price range have bezels that don't line up correctly. This isn't a big deal to me, and I'm not deducting points for the Komodo's slightly misaligned bezel. However, I find the wobbly stem and loose end link disconcerting. The lack of attention to detail in smoothing the crown, The sides of the links, and especially the bezel, belies the Komodo's outward appearance of quality. Please subscribe. Please like.